Well, I spoke in that debate in 2013. I commend it to you even now. It was an amazing debate. But there's no doubt at all that the public pressure against joining the all-out war against Syria made the difference. As the great English man of letters, Dr. Johnson, said, the knowledge that one is to be hanged in the morning concentrates the mind wonderfully. And MPs are metaphorically hanged every 4 years or 5 years, or nowadays every 2 years. And I can tell you, as a member of the House of Commons for almost 30 years, if you get 5 emails on the same subject from your constituents, your voters, especially if your majority is small, you note it. If you get 50, if you get 500, you're convening meetings with your staff to plan a response. So never underestimate the power of a public mobilized, even if it's just a letter. Even better if you go and see them. Never underestimate the importance of that. So if you're a Member of Parliament, and I speak to the people in the hall, but the many thousands who are watching this live, make sure that your Member of Parliament, who doesn't know when they might be hanged, there might be a general election very much sooner than expected. We have to make the Assange issue a burning political issue throughout the land. And everyone in Parliament has to know that there is a cost. There is a political cost to their acquiescence, still more their collaboration with the machinery seeking to extradite Julian to the dungeons of the United States. The next speaker, Alexander Mercurs, is the editor of the excellent Duran magazine, and I welcome him to the microphone. Alexander.
Thank you, George. What I will say today, I'd like to build a bit on what George was saying about this being essentially a political issue. Because, of course, what we're looking at the moment is what is supposed to be a legal process. And it's that legal process I'm going to discuss, because I'm going to argue that this legal process is clearly, radically, essentially wrong. Now, since these charges that have been brought against Julian Assange originate from the United States, I'm going to do something unusual, and I think it'll be a bit dry, but I think it'll be informative. I'm going to quote to you what American lawyers are saying about this. This is because in any case which involves the United States, with a charge brought in the United States, it is American law that matters. Now, the key law, the law that is the fundamental law that governs the way journalism is supposed to be conducted in the United States, and which sets out the issue of freedom of the press, is the First Amendment to the Constitution. And it reads as follows: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, the key words obviously are Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech and of the press. Now, the case everybody in the United States always refers to in any case involving the First Amendment is the Pentagon Papers case. The Pentagon Papers was a case which happened in 1971 when a whistleblower leaked, from within the Pentagon, leaked a huge amount of papers that showed that US policy during the Vietnam War had been entirely intentional and calculated, that the story that the United States blundered into that war with good intentions was wrong, and he was able to prove it on the basis of the documentation that the Pentagon itself had produced and which he published through the New York Times. Now, the United States government attempted to prosecute the New York Times to prevent publication of the Pentagon Papers. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court of the United States said, no, you cannot stop publication of the Pentagon Papers because doing so is contrary to the First Amendment of the Constitution. Now, I'm going to just mention at this point what a particular American lawyer says about this in relation to the case which is now being brought against Julian Assange. This is an American lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, who I disagree with almost entirely on every political issue. But I do accept that he is an outstanding lawyer. I don't think that has any issue about this. Now, what he says is this. If the prosecutors were to charge Assange with espionage or any other crime for merely publishing the Manning material, this would be another Pentagon Papers case, i.e. a First Amendment case, with the same likely outcome. Many people have misunderstood the actual Supreme Court ruling in 1971. It did not say that the newspapers planning to publish the Pentagon Papers could not be prosecuted if they published classified material. It only said that they could not be restrained or stopped in advance from publishing them. Well, they did publish, and they were not prosecuted. Now, that is the view, not just of Alan Dershowitz, it was also the view of Barack Obama's Department of Justice. They looked into this very carefully, and they said, if we start prosecuting Julian Assange for publishing classified material as a journalist, that will fail because of the First Amendment defense that was used in the Pentagon Papers case, and if it were to succeed, which we don't think, then it might have an effect on freedom of speech and of the press generally. That was the view that Barack Obama's Department of Justice took. It is also the view, incidentally, of Rudy Giuliani, who is Donald Trump's personal lawyer, former mayor of New York, former federal prosecutor, and also someone who has represented Trump during the Mueller investigation. He has gone out publicly and said the same thing. So, we're looking at a potential problem for the United States under the First Amendment if they go after Julian. Now, it's been mentioned here, there's been a discussion here about whether, in fact, Julian Assange has the right to this protection. People have said, well, you know, he's not actually really a journalist, or he's not a real journalist. I want to state on record that I personally think that Julian Assange is a great journalist. But let's see what Alan Dershowitz has to say about that argument. This is a legal argument that he's making now. He says, prosecutors might try to distinguish the cases on the grounds that the New York Times is a more responsible outlet than WikiLeaks. But the First Amendment does not recognize degrees of responsibility. When the Constitution was written, our nation was plagued with irresponsible scandal sheets and broadsheets. No one described political pamphleteers, Tom Paine or James Callender, as responsible journalists of their day. Not only is that argument phony and a smear of Julian Assange, it has no basis in law. It should not be made. Anyone who makes it is speaking in bad faith. Now, the United States, the US government, the Department of Justice, Donald Trump's Department of Justice, knows that they have a major problem bringing a case under the First Amendment. So they haven't done that. They've tried instead this extremely strange case in which they are basically accusing Julian Assange of engaging in a computer fraud with Chelsea Manning, Bradley Manning, as she was then, to try to get information, to extract information from the computer. Now, what does Dershowitz say about this case? The courts have ruled that journalists may not break the law in an effort to obtain material whose disclosure would be protected by the First Amendment. But the problem with the current effort, he means the case against Julian Assange, is that while it might be legally strong, it seems on the face of the indictment to be factually weak. It alleges that, quote, Assange encouraged Manning to provide information and records, unquote, from federal government agencies, that, quote, Manning provided Assange with part of a password, unquote, and that, quote, Assange requested more information, unquote. It goes on to say that Assange was, quote, trying to crack the password, but had no luck so far. So what does Dershowitz say? Not the strongest set of facts here. Well, I would say that was an understatement. And in fact, Dershowitz goes on to say, the first question is whether a legal theory based on such inchoate facts will be sufficient for an extradition request. Now, I'm going to say something here which I'd like to touch on, which is that obviously the facts for this conspiracy are extremely weak on the face of the indictment. What is very concerning is that the United States government appears to be trying to get those facts, make them look stronger by trying to get Julian Assange's alleged co-conspirator, Chelsea Manning, to testify against him. And the effect is that Chelsea Manning is now being held in what appears to be indefinite detention because she is refusing to provide evidence before a grand jury. I have to say that Chelsea Manning's courage and integrity fills me with awe. I have no hesitation in saying that I consider her heroic. Anyway, so do we really want to extradite Julian Assange to a country where people are held in indefinite detention in order to get them to testify against each other? Obviously not. Now, what did Julian Assange actually do? Why did he do it? Well, I'm now going to turn to another American lawyer, one who I tend to agree with rather more, who is Glenn Greenwald. Now, Greenwald is important because he's not just a lawyer and a very fine lawyer, he's also a journalist. So he understands journalism very well, and he has a very strong interest in these sort of cases because they affect his own practice and work as a journalist. So what does Greenwald say? He says the following: the key fact being widely misreported is that the indictment accuses Assange of trying to help Manning obtain access to document databases to which she had no valid access, i.e. hacking rather than journalism. But the indictment alleges no such thing. Rather, it simply accuses Assange of trying to help Manning log into the Defense Department's computers using a different username so that she could maintain her anonymity while downloading documents in the public interest and then furnish them to WikiLeaks to publish. In other words, the indictment seeks to criminalize what journalists are not only permitted but ethically required to do, take steps to help their sources maintain their anonymity. We've heard earlier today from Annie Macken how important it is for journalists to protect their sources if whistleblowers are actually to be able to do their job properly. This is a very dangerous indictment. It goes to the root of what journalists do. It is intended to make the whole process of journalistic investigation all but impossible, especially when it concerns secrets, the most important secrets that governments in the United States and elsewhere want to keep hidden. Now, it gets even worse about this case, because something which I've never seen anybody mention except one person, and that is that this case against Julian Assange is actually brought out of time. Now, what I mean by that is that there is a statute of limitation in the United States which says that cases of this sort should be brought within 5 years. Now, what happened, whatever it was that Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning were doing together, they did in 2010. We're now in 2019. The indictment against them dates from, I believe, 2017. It's almost 8 years later. So I'm now going to turn to another American lawyer. This is Andrew McCarthy, a federal prosecutor, a man who is deeply, deeply hostile to Julian Assange, a man of very conservative views, someone I again don't agree with on most issues, but who is nonetheless an outstanding lawyer. What does he say about the limitation issue? He says, how is the Justice Department able to prosecute Assange on an indictment filed 3 years after the prescribed limitation period? It appears that the Justice Department is relying on an exception in Section 2332B of the Penal Code that extends the statute of limitations to 8 years for, quote, acts of terrorism transcending national boundaries, unquote. Now, Andrew McCarthy then goes on to say this. I repeat, this is someone who is very hostile to Julian Assange. Now, conspiracy to commit computer fraud is a very serious offence, and Assange is at the top of the serious range. And there's no doubt that the conspiracy transcended national boundaries. Assange was outside the United States when he collaborated with Manning. But is it really an act of terrorism? Now, Andrew McCarthy goes into a long, erudite discussion about this issue. And if you want to read his article, it's on National Review. He thinks the US government may have an arguable case because the word terrorism is so broadly defined in US law. I've looked at these arguments. I'm going to say straightforwardly, I don't agree. Besides, what does Andrew McCarthy say? It will be a hotly contested issue. Well, yes. And he goes on to say, if the Justice Department is going to succeed in prosecuting Assange, it is going to have to win the statute of limitation argument twice, in Britain and in Virginia. That's not going to be a layup, to say the least. Well, certainly not. So we have, what to all appearances, an extraordinary flimsy case here. We have no real case, it would seem, on the First Amendment, on the Espionage Act. So that's why it's not being brought. And we have this cobbled together case that's actually being brought based upon an allegation of conspiracy in which the co-conspirator is not being prosecuted and in which, as a result, she finds herself in indefinite detention. How does our government, how do our courts extradite on the basis of all this nonsense? Well, I have to say, I would have said in any proper system of law, they wouldn't extradite. But let's look at what the story of Julian Assange has been. Firstly, he was, as we know, sentenced today to 50 weeks in prison. This is in connection with skipping bail in a case, and it was absolutely correct to say it's a case which originates with allegations of sexual misconduct in Sweden. Julian Assange gave answers to the Swedish investigators in Sweden. He then gave answers again to the Swedish investigators in the Ecuador embassy when they interviewed him there. There is a statement which he published which deals with those allegations in great detail, which has been published, I believe, on the internet, and it may still be there for all I know. The Swedes got all this information from Julian Assange. They never brought charges against him. They are now coming under extraordinary political pressure to bring charges against him, which, by the way, I find extremely disturbing, but we'll put that to one side. Let me repeat, he has been sentenced for 50 weeks in prison for skipping bail in a case which was never brought, which doesn't exist. Now, given that that is so, how can any of us feel confident about the legal processes in this case? We have an extraordinary case in the United States, which, as we've seen, prominent American lawyers are extremely skeptical about. We've seen an extraordinary case against him here in Britain. We heard the judge today paying no attention at all to any of the points that Julian Assange's counsel put to her and giving the maximum sentence. I think one of our earlier speakers said, this doesn't feel right. It isn't right. That's why it doesn't feel right. This case is not going to be won in the courts. It's going to be won in places like this, by people like us, people coming here, protesting, speaking out, pointing out how wrong this is, how abysmally this man is being treated by our courts, by our legal system, by the authorities. And we must renew the political struggle to defend him. This frightful machine that has been unleashed upon him for publishing things which have always been true and which it is in our interests to know is a frightful machine which is ultimately going to attack all of us. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for being here, and thank you for listening.
Right, can I thank two of our speakers for coming here tonight, but they unfortunately have to leave. They've train to get home, and that's Mr. Peter Ford, who's just leaving now, and and also Kirsten from WikiLeaks. Thank you so much for coming. Right, I would also like to thank Reverend Simon and those on the church board here who didn't give in to online intimidation and threats from activists. These horrible enemies of peace want to stifle our debate, and who are no different from those in the establishment and who are censoring our voices and that of alternative media outlets. So before calling our next speaker, I'd like to say that without two of the speakers here tonight, Imperialism on Trial events would never have taken place. Firstly, I attended Froome's Stop Wars Media on Trial event 2 years ago, and I thought I really want to put something like this on in my hometown in Derry in the north of Ireland. And that is Sheila Coombs from Froome's Stop War. Then I had the task of trying to get it somehow funded or interest in it in Derry, and there was no takers, unfortunately. But I met George Galloway, who spoke at an event in Derry nearly 2 years ago, and he passed on my proposal to RT, and RT thankfully have supported and live streamed. This is the 5th event now that they've live streamed for me for Imperialism on Trial. So I'd also like to thank George, and to Russia Today, thank you. So can I call Sheila Coombs from Froome's Stop War as our next speaker? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Greg, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. Imperialism on Trial is a fantastic progression from the Media on Trial events that we did. So thanks very much to Greg for picking up the baton, going on, putting so much energy into all the events that he's done and getting so many excellent speakers. Right, I'd like to talk about WikiLeaks in terms of how they've helped the anti-war community. It's not just the collateral murder video, and it's not just the 90,000 documented incidents in the Afghan war log that have thrown a light on the brutality of the wars in the 21st century. But it's also the machinations exposed in the emails, the machinations of people in the State Department and their allies internationally, to bring about war and deadly regime change. One such of these Machiavellian emails is this one. This is just the header from the email. It was written by Sir William Roebuck in 2006. He was the US ambassador to Damascus. He's writing in this email, he's putting forward lots of suggestions as to how he could, as he puts it, throw Assad off balance. He's got lots of Machiavellian schemes about how to undermine the Assad regime, including he states that they ought to stress Iranian influence in Syria, hoping to sort of engender a sectarian divide, which is a typical imperialist tactic. I'm talking about imperialism on trial. He was advocating this old, it's actually a British imperial from the British Empire, divide and conquer, create a sectarian divide. So this email goes on, it's quite lengthy, and he's got all of these schemes which he's trying to impress people with. That was 2006. What I also particularly note about this email, which I find it's very useful that WikiLeaks has exposed this, is the recipient list. The recipients are the the Department of Treasury, Israel, Tel Aviv, the National Security Council, that's understandable, Secretary of State, that's understandable, the League of Arab States, supposedly understandable, US mission to the European Union in Brussels, the United Nations. Now that's what really resonated with me. The United Nations knew about this email in 2006, in which Roebuck was planning all of these schemes to destabilise the Syrian government. As I said, he uses the words "throw Assad off balance." So that was 2006. So why didn't an organisation that was set up to be an honest arbiter in international relations, with international law at its core, the United Nations, why didn't they pick this up as sort of preparations for war? Why didn't they flag this up? Even worse, 5 years later, when some of these mechanisms he was suggesting were being put into play, why didn't the United Nations say, "Oh, come on, there's something wrong here. So there's some sort of nasty business going on." They didn't do that. Instead, they very much went along with the rhetoric of peaceful protesters searching, wanting democracy and freedom, being repressed by a brutal dictator. So they went along with that. And even the Syrian ambassador to the UN, which is Bashar Jafari, he was excluded from UN sessions which were discussing events in his own country. I mean, I find that really quite despicable. So I think we have to thank WikiLeaks not only for exposing the emails and the thoughts of the bad guys, but also exposing the collusion of some of the good guys. And we like to think the UN is a good guy, but I think they've colluded here. So thanks to WikiLeaks for that. But reading... but reading through this book, which my husband bought me this for my birthday a few years ago, the WikiLeaks files, we can see that many of the machinations for regime change coincide with the targets of the Washington neocons. So if you look at the various regime changes that this book deals with, they've been stated quite openly by the Washington neocons. They made no secret about it. Leading neocons like Richard Pearl, Michael Ledeen, John Bolton, William Crystal, and others openly stated that they wanted to see regime change in Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran. Sorry? Sorry, the project? Yes, exactly. Yes, that's right. Yes, they wanted to see regime change in Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Libya, Syria, and North Korea. So it wasn't a surprise. It was known. It was out there. But again, when these things started to happen, nobody in the media, in the international, in government said, "Oh, look, that's a bit strange that we're seeing this list played out in the 21st century exactly as prescribed by the Washington neocons." If you want to understand who the Washington neocons are, or neoconservatives is the full name, I really recommend that you watch a BBC Panorama programme from 2003 called The War Party. It's practically unheard of for me to recommend anything from the BBC, but that is an excellent documentary. And it speaks to people in 2003, actually interviews the neoconservatives in Washington. They have an ideology, they say, of spreading democracy and freedom, but particularly in the Middle East. But that democracy and freedom has killed so many people and has been rolled out again and again and again. And it's those two tenets, democracy and freedom, have basically become weaponized in the 21st century. So as I say, I am shocked that the international community haven't sort of related these regime change to this group of people. And if we're talking about imperialism on trial, I think that the neocons are central to imperialist moves. So not only did we have the countries in the Middle East that have been subjected to these regime changes, but Venezuela's been on their list. And of course, Venezuela is in the news at the moment with a key neocon, John Bolton, right at the front. Then obviously Putin's Russia is very much in their sights. And to that end, we saw Victoria Nuland, wife of Robert Kagan, an arch-neocon. She was responsible for orchestrating the 2014 coup in Ukraine. That coup removed a democratically elected leader and destabilized a country right on Russia's border. There was a lot of intent in that. So we find that the Washington neocons seem to sort of be able to maneuver to sort of various different political factions. First of all, they started off with the Washington neocons, started off with Republicans, the US Republicans, with Bush and Blair's New Labour in England. They affected the Iraq War with that relationship. But later, they moved to US Democrats who have the who do humanitarian interventionism and Hillary Clinton's responsibility to protect. These were two very useful mechanisms to put regime changes in power, in place, make out that they humanitarian interventions, or that their responsibility to protect. It went away from the Republicans, which people were seeing more as very much, warmongering and on the right, and it softened the whole thing to looking as if it was, wanting ostensibly to protect the citizens and all this sort of thing. So Hillary was a key driver in the Libya intervention. Although the media, aligned media, very much made out that it was Britain and France that were spearheading it, but actually it was Hillary who was driving it. WikiLeaks released 30,000 of her emails off her private server. 17,000 of those referred to Libya. She has emails headed TikTok to Libya. And they detail strategies. It's sort of a counting down of strategies of how to undermine Gaddafi's Libya. So it's no wonder that when she heard of his brutal murder, she cackled and said, "We came, we saw, he died." Yeah, disgusting, absolutely disgusting. And as far as she was concerned, it was a job well done. But Hillary, of late, has overextended herself, I'm very happy to say. Her lies with regard to the Russiagate conspiracy theory are unravelling. Her DNC's malfeasance in undermining her running mate, her Democratic Party running mate, Bernie Sanders, at the primaries, was exposed in leaked, not hacked, but leaked emails. Her childish deflection from the expose of her and her DNC crimes was her contention that, Russia did it. So this was very dangerous and led US politicians and aligned media to frame the supposed Russian hacking of her emails as an act of war. So she, rather than the mainstream media and analysts and looking at the content of the emails and exposing the malfeasance of what her DNC and she had done in the emails, like a child, she just said, Russia did it. And they all turned to, okay, Russia did it. It's so simplistic, infantile and stupid, but that's what we've come down to in today's political world. But what I think is that couldn't we logically assume that a DNC member who'd wanted Bernie Sanders to be the Democratic presidential candidate and had perhaps witnessed some of the machinations of Hillary and her DNC team to undermine him, couldn't we assume that perhaps that disgruntled person might have downloaded the emails on site and passed them to a WikiLeaks contact, and that it was nothing to do with any Russian hacking at all? I think that's probably quite a lot more of a plausible thing. But as I say, Hillary's deceit in claiming Russia did it has been very dangerous. It has been cited as an act of war, and it's pitted two nuclear superpowers against each other. And a mainstream media has wholly colluded in this, trumpeting her claim. So Hillary and her media chums stand to lose an awful lot should Julian Assange reveal the source of the emails to WikiLeaks. And Assange quite clearly states it wasn't Russia. Sorry? Yes. Well, that's another subject. Yeah. We've got to note as well that the level of desperation of the mainstream media in the last few weeks, with their smears, one after another, brought out on Assange, since he's been arrested. And I think that's because they're worried and they're running scared and they're doubling down on their vilification of him. So you may think that I'm homing in on poor old Hillary quite a bit, which I am. But she is just as a legitimate target as Bush or Blair. Her lies with regard to Russian meddling were potentially as dangerous as theirs with regard to Iraq's WMDs. We have to thank Julian Assange and WikiLeaks for the near decade of work it has undertaken to give transparency to the machinations for preemptive wars of intervention and regime change. Journalist or not, publisher or not, Julian Assange is a truth teller, and we need Julian Assange. Thank you.